Jonathan Hayes adjusted the collar of his plain black shirt and took a deep breath before stepping through the doors of Brewhaven's flagship cafe. The familiar scent of freshly ground coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of baked goods. But today, it felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't entering as the CEO of the company he had built from the ground up. He was just another new hire, John Harper, a middle-aged man looking for work. The transformation had been meticulous. His usually clean-shaven face now sported a rough stubble. His signature silver-streaked hair had been darkened, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. Gone were the tailored suits and leather shoes. Instead, he wore a simple uniform, black jeans, a faded apron, and a name tag that felt foreign against his chest. He had rehearsed his story countless times. Former warehouse worker, lost his job due to downsizing, looking for something steady, nothing too complicated, just enough truth to make the lie believable. The cafe was busy, the hum of conversation blending with the hissing of the espresso machines. Customers lined up at the counter, scrolling through their phones, barely glancing at the workers scrambling behind the bar. Employees moved with quiet efficiency, their expressions focused but distant. Jonathan had expected warmth, energy. After all, Brewhaven had been founded on the idea of creating a welcoming space. Instead, there was a dullness in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone inside. He spotted the woman he had been told to report to, Mia Carter, shift supervisor. She was easy to recognize. Late 20s, dark brown hair tied back in a tight ponytail, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. There was something sharp about her, a quiet intensity in the way she moved, her eyes scanning the room as if bracing for the next crisis. She barely looked at him when he approached. New guy. Jonathan nodded. John Harper. I was told to start today. She grabbed an apron from a nearby hook and tossed it to him. You've worked in a cafe before? No, but I'm a fast learner. Mia let out a quiet sigh, already moving toward the counter. Great. Hope you like trial by fire. He followed her behind the bar, immediately overwhelmed by the organized chaos. The espresso machine whined as a barista pulled a shot, steam curling into the air. Another worker frothed milk with practiced indifference. Orders popped up on a screen faster than they could be filled. It was relentless, a rhythm he had never experienced from this side of the counter. Take orders, Mia instructed, barely pausing as she passed him a tablet. Be quick, be clear, and for the love of God, don't mess up the sizes. Jonathan fumbled through the first few customers, fingers awkward on the screen. A woman rolled her eyes when he hesitated over the difference between a macchiato and a cortado. A man in a suit tapped his foot impatiently when Jonathan misheard his name for the order. Mia stepped in twice, correcting his mistakes without so much as a glance in his direction. He expected impatience, maybe even irritation, but there was something else in her demeanor: exhaustion. Not just the physical kind, but something deeper, a weariness that had settled into her bones. She moved efficiently, but without joy. The same could be said for the rest of the team. They weren't just busy, they were tense. Then there was Rick Thompson. Jonathan hadn't met him yet, but he didn't have to. He felt the shift in the room the moment the man walked in. The staff straightened, shoulders tightening, voices lowering. Conversations died mid-sentence. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of reaction people had to someone who held too much power over them. Rick was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his uniform crisp, his presence suffocating. He stopped behind one of the baristas, watching over her shoulder as she prepared a drink. That's too much foam, he said, voice deceptively casual. The girl flinched and started again without a word. Jonathan forced himself to keep taking orders, resisting the urge to intervene. He had expected to find some inefficiencies, maybe some lazy management, but this was different. As the hours dragged on, his mistakes piled up. He dropped a cup, sending scalding coffee across the counter. He forgot to call out an order, leaving a frustrated customer waiting. His back ached from standing, his throat dry from repeating the same greetings over and over. He had built this company. And yet, today, he was just another overwhelmed employee struggling to keep up. Near closing time, Mia wiped down the counter with sharp, deliberate movements. "You survived your first shift," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Jonathan exhaled, stretching his sore fingers. "Barely." She glanced at him then, really looking at him for the first time. There was something guarded in her expression, but also a flicker of something else, curiosity. "You'll get used to it," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. He wanted to ask her if she believed that, if she ever had. But before he could, Rick called her name from the back. Mia's entire posture changed. Her fingers tightened around the cloth she had been using, shoulders locking in place. She hesitated, just for a second, before heading toward the office. Jonathan watched her go, a knot forming in his stomach. He didn't know what was behind that door, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in this cafe wasn't just mismanagement. It was something far worse. Jonathan had spent years in boardrooms, listening to reports and statistics about customer satisfaction and employee retention. None of those numbers had prepared him for the reality of working inside his own cafe. By his third shift, the patterns became clear. This wasn't just a stressful job. It was a place where exhaustion had become routine, where workers functioned like machines, their movements efficient but hollow. Conversations were clipped, laughter non-existent. No one lingered after their shifts. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, an invisible thread that connected them all in shared resignation. Rick Thompson was at the center of it. Jonathan had watched him closely, had felt the man's presence in the way people reacted, before he even spoke. He didn't need to yell or threaten. A glance, a scoff, a comment muttered, just loud enough to be heard. That was enough to keep everyone on edge. He had perfected the art of breaking people down in small, subtle ways. "Why do you look confused? Do you not understand basic instructions? You should be moving faster by now. This isn't complicated. I could have hired someone else, you know? Maybe I should have." Jonathan saw how the words landed. He saw the way Mia clenched her jaw, the way Daniel, the young barista with tired eyes, flinched when Rick hovered too close. Even customers seemed to notice, their eyes darting between the employees and their manager with quiet unease. But no one said anything. No one pushed back. The worst part? Jonathan could see why. Rick had control over everything, the schedule, the hours, who got the easier shifts, and who was stuck closing 3 nights in a row. He could make or break an employee's experience with a single decision, and he knew it. It was a slow kind of suffocation, the kind that drained people without them even realizing how much they had lost. Mia, more than anyone, carried the weight of it. She was the one who took the brunt of Rick's scrutiny, the one expected to keep the cafe running smoothly while absorbing his constant criticism. She was sharp, efficient, but there was something fragile beneath it, a tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers tapped against the counter when she thought no one was looking. That's why Jonathan wasn't surprised when he found her in the storage room late one evening, sitting on an overturned crate, her head buried in her hands. She didn't notice him at first. He hesitated at the doorway, the sight of her so starkly different from the hardened exterior she usually maintained. For a moment, he considered walking away, giving her the space she clearly needed. But then she exhaled shakily, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes, and something in him refused to stay silent. "You okay?" She stiffened immediately, her head snapping up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression guarded. "What are you doing back here?" "Inventory," he lied smoothly, stepping further inside. He gestured vaguely toward the shelves. "Or, pretending to anyway." She huffed a quiet, humorless laugh, but didn't relax. "You shouldn't be back here. You shouldn't have to hide to get a moment to breathe." That made her pause. For a second, she looked like she might snap at him, push him away with some sharp remark. But then the fight drained out of her, and she just shook her head. "You don't get it," she muttered. Jonathan crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Then explain it to me." She studied him, something calculating in her gaze. "You're new," she said finally. "You haven't been here long enough to understand how things work." He thought about all the things he had seen, all the things he had felt in just a few short days. "I understand more than you think." Mia exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "It's not just the job. It's him." Jonathan didn't need to ask who she meant. "He pushes people until they break," she continued, voice quiet but steady. "He makes you think that every mistake is your fault, that you're lucky to even be here. And if you push back—" She let out a bitter laugh. "You don't last long." Jonathan felt something cold settle in his chest. He had built Brewhaven on the belief that employees were the foundation of a great business, that if you treated your people well, they would take care of everything else. Yet here he was, standing in the ruins of that ideal, watching the people he had promised to support struggle under the weight of mismanagement and quiet cruelty. "How long are you planning to stay?" Mia asked suddenly. Jonathan blinked. "What?" She shrugged, but there was something careful in the way she looked at him. "You seem like the kind of guy who won't put up with this for long." "Most don't." He could have told her the truth then, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was here to fix this from the inside out. But instead he just met her gaze and said, "Long enough." She studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Then watch your back." Jonathan didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Jonathan had always believed that leadership was about trust. Sitting in his corporate office, he had imagined his employees as a team, people working together toward a shared vision. But here, inside the cafe that bore his company's name, he saw something very different. Fear, resentment, silence. The weight of that realization settled heavily on him, solidifying into something sharp and unrelenting. He had been blind for too long, but not anymore. That evening, he stayed late, watching from behind the counter as Rick made his final rounds before closing. The cafe was empty except for the employees, their movements sluggish after a long shift. Rick leaned against the espresso machine, arms crossed as he eyed Mia, who was wiping down the counters. "That took long enough," he muttered. She didn't react, just kept scrubbing, her jaw tight. Rick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You should be grateful, you know. Plenty of people would kill for this job." Jonathan felt his hands clench into fists. Mia stilled, her shoulders lifting with a deep inhale. Slowly, she turned to face him. "Grateful?" Rick smirked, as if amused by the idea that she would dare question him. "You think you have it bad here? Try working somewhere that actually treats you like you're disposable." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. "You mean like the way you treat us?" A sharp silence followed. Rick's smirk faltered. "Watch your tone." No, the word came out quiet but firm. Jonathan watched as something flickered in Rick's eyes, something dangerous. He had no doubt that if he weren't standing there, Rick would have leaned in, would have found some way to make her feel small. But Jonathan was there, and he was done watching. He stepped forward. "She's right." Rick turned, eyes narrowing. "What?" "You treat your employees like they're nothing," Jonathan said evenly, stepping past the counter. "Like they should be grateful for scraps. You think that's leadership?" Rick scoffed. "Spare me the speech, new guy. You don't know how things work." Jonathan held his gaze. "No, I don't think you do." Mia looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. The other employees had stopped what they were doing, eyes wide as they took in the confrontation unfolding before them. Rick let out a laugh, shaking his head. "I don't have time for this." He turned to leave, but Jonathan wasn't done. "You don't belong here." That stopped him. Slowly, Rick turned back. "Excuse me?" Jonathan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't belong in a position of power. Not here. Not anywhere." Rick's expression twisted into something ugly. And who exactly do you think you are? Jonathan exhaled. This was it. No more hiding. I'm the owner. Silence crashed over the room. Rick blinked, his mouth opening slightly, as if his brain was struggling to catch up. Mia's eyes widened, a sharp inhale breaking from her lips. The other employees looked at one another, confusion giving way to shock. Jonathan let the words settle before continuing. I built this company from the ground up, he said. And I trusted people like you to run it the right way. Clearly, that was a mistake. Rick's face darkened. This is a joke. Jonathan shook his head. No, the joke is that I let someone like you poison my cafe for as long as you have. For the first time since meeting him, Rick looked unsure. He glanced around as if searching for some kind of support, but no one moved. No one spoke. He was alone. You can leave now, Jonathan said, voice steady. Rick let out a harsh laugh. You don't have the guts. Jonathan stepped forward until they were nearly nose to nose. Try me. A long, tense beat passed. Then Rick scoffed, shaking his head as he grabbed his coat from the hook near the door. You're making a mistake, he muttered. Jonathan didn't answer. He just watched as Rick stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. The moment he was gone, a collective exhale rippled through the cafe. Mia was staring at Jonathan, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. So, that just happened? A wry smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. Yeah, it did. For the first time in a long while, the cafe didn't feel suffocating. The cafe felt different in the days that followed. The air no longer carried the weight of unspoken frustrations, nor did the walls seem to close in with the tension of forced silence. The employees still moved cautiously, as if expecting Rick to return at any moment, his scowl cutting through whatever fragile peace had settled in his absence. But he was gone, and Jonathan was here. He had never intended to run the cafe himself. That had never been the point of going undercover. But now, standing behind the counter, learning how to steam milk just right, how to fold a croissant properly, how to listen, really listen, he realized how far removed he had been from the people who made his company what it was. Mia, skeptical at first, watched him carefully. She wasn't the only one. The others, too, observed from a distance, waiting to see if his presence was temporary or if he would disappear the moment things settled. He didn't blame them. Trust was something earned, not given freely. He worked beside them, not as their boss, but as another set of hands. He stayed late, scrubbing floors, organizing inventory, making sure the schedules were fair. He rewrote policies, ensuring that no one would ever have to endure what Mia had. Most of all, he listened to their stories, their struggles, their dreams, their reasons for staying even when things had been unbearable. Slowly, the cafe came alive again. Laughter returned in small bursts, cautious at first, but growing in confidence. The regulars noticed the change, too. The baristas no longer forced smiles through exhaustion. The warmth in their service was real, not rehearsed. It was the kind of cafe Jonathan had envisioned when he first built the company. One evening, as the last customers trickled out, Mia leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You know, I didn't think you'd actually stay. Jonathan looked up from the espresso machine, where he had just pulled an imperfect shot. He frowned at it before setting it aside. Yeah, she nodded. Guys like you usually show up, make a speech, fire the bad guy, and then leave? He sighed, wiping his hands on a towel. I was that guy once. Thought fixing a problem meant removing one bad apple. He glanced at her. Turns out, sometimes the whole tree needs tending. Mia studied him for a long moment before her lips quirked up in a small, reluctant smile. Not bad, boss. Jonathan, he corrected. Not bad, Jonathan. He grinned, feeling something settle in his chest, something solid, something real. The cafe wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. And that, he realized, was exactly what it was supposed to be,